and every one of you. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. The clock on the wall glowed with the faint light of 2:14 a.m. as Bob paced the living room, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The dimly lit space was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. The boys were asleep upstairs, their soft breaths the only thing anchoring him to the moment. His phone, lying on the coffee table, remained silent, a damning testament to Sue's absence. This wasn't the first time she had stayed out late, but tonight felt different. Something gnawed at him, a visceral instinct he couldn't ignore. He had replayed her words in his mind a dozen times. Just a quick dinner with the girls, she had said, planting a dismissive kiss on his cheek before disappearing out the door. Hours later, her silence screamed louder than any excuse she could conjure. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through their messages. Nothing since her last curt text. Running late, don't wait up. Bob's heart ached as he stared at her picture on the screen, a snapshot of their honeymoon in Hawaii. She was radiant in the photo, her laughter infectious even through the pixels. How had they gone from that moment of unfiltered joy to this chasm of suspicion and doubt? He set the phone down with a thud and raked his hands through his hair. When the sound of tires crunching on gravel finally broke the stillness, his heart skipped a beat. The headlights illuminated the driveway for a brief moment before the car engine went silent. Bob stood by the window, watching as Sue stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She swayed slightly, her movements languid, as if the weight of her deceit were nothing at all. She pushed the door open and froze when she saw him standing there. Her face twisted into a mask of irritation, not guilt. "You're still up?" she asked, slipping her purse onto the counter as if she hadn't been gone all night. "Where have you been?" Bob's voice was low, measured, but laced with the fury he fought to contain. "With Beth," she replied casually, her tone dismissive. "I told you I might be late." "Late?" His voice rose slightly. "Sue, it's 2 a.m. You didn't call, you didn't answer my texts. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" She rolled her eyes and kicked off her heels. "Bob, don't be so dramatic. I told you, we had a few drinks and I didn't want to drive back right away. You should be thanking me for being responsible." Responsible, he repeated, incredulous. "Do you think leaving me here to worry all night is responsible?" "The boys." "Oh, don't start with the boys," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "They were asleep the whole time. You're just upset because I'm not stuck at home like some perfect little housewife." Bob took a step back, her words hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't the woman he had married, the woman who once claimed to value their family above all else. He stared at her, searching for some flicker of remorse, but found none. "You're slipping away from us," he said finally, his voice cracking under the weight of his heartbreak. "From me? From the boys? Is that what you want?" Sue laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made his stomach churn. "You're imagining things. I have a life outside this house, Bob. Maybe you should get one too." And with that, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving him standing alone in the dim light of the living room. As the sound of her footsteps faded, Bob sank into the couch, his hands trembling. He felt like a man grasping at sand, his once solid life slipping through his fingers. He had given her everything, love, stability, the life they had both dreamed of. And yet, it wasn't enough. He stared at the empty space where she had stood moments ago, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Whatever was pulling Sue away from him, he would find it. And when he did, he vowed silently he wouldn't just take it lying down. The next morning, Bob awoke to the sound of laughter drifting from the kitchen. He rubbed his eyes, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind like a bad dream. As he walked into the kitchen, he saw Sue at the stove, flipping pancakes while the boys sat at the table, giggling at some joke she had made. "Morning," she said brightly, her tone sickeningly normal. Bob forced a smile, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than usual. How could she act so casual, as if nothing had happened? He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the boy's presence made it impossible. "Morning," he replied, kissing each of the boys on the head before pouring himself a cup of coffee. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine, taking the kids to soccer practice, managing business calls, and attending a meeting at the dealership. But through it all, Bob's mind was elsewhere, his thoughts circling back to Sue's behavior. By evening, he had made up his mind. If Sue wouldn't give him answers, he would find them himself. And so, as she left for another supposed girls' night, Bob slipped into the garage and installed a GPS tracker on her car. It felt wrong, invasive, but he needed to know. For his own sanity, for the sake of their family, he needed the truth. Little did he know, the truth he would uncover would be far darker than he could have imagined, and it would set him on a path he could never return from. The GPS tracker was a small device, barely the size of his palm, but it felt heavy in Bob's hand as he secured it under Sue's car. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and stepped back, staring at the vehicle as if it held all the answers he didn't want to confront. When Sue drove off that evening, Bob sat in the living room with his laptop, the GPS software open on the screen. A small red dot blinked steadily, marking her location in real time. At first, the path she took seemed ordinary. She headed to the city, stopping briefly at what looked like a cafe. Bob's chest tightened, a flicker of hope blooming inside him. Maybe she really is just meeting friends, he thought, but that it didn't stay there long. It moved across the city, stopping at an upscale bar. Then an hour later, it shifted again to a residential area on the other side of town. Bob leaned forward, his heart pounding. The address wasn't familiar. He zoomed in on the map, trying to make sense of it. Why would she be there? By the time the dot came to rest outside a small hotel, Bob's hope had curdled into dread. He closed the laptop, his hands trembling. His worst fears were no longer just shadows in his mind. They were tangible, undeniable. And yet, he couldn't confront her. Not yet. He needed more than a blinking red dot to expose the truth. He needed evidence that even Sue couldn't deny. The next few days passed in a blur of careful observation and rising tension. Sue's absences became more frequent, her excuses flimsier. Bob started noticing other changes. How she kept her phone glued to her hand, her sudden increase in cash withdrawals, the way her gaze darted away whenever he asked about her plans. Each new detail was like a piece of a puzzle, and Bob was determined to see the full picture. He began documenting everything, dates, times, places. He went through their financial records, noting unexplained expenses. A private investigator might have been the smarter choice, but Bob wasn't ready to involve anyone else. Not yet. One evening, Sue came home late again, her makeup smudged and her dress slightly askew. She looked at Bob with a mix of annoyance and indifference, as if daring him to question her. "How was your night?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Fine," she replied curtly, brushing past him. "Don't wait up next time. You're just making yourself miserable." Her words stung, but Bob forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to tip his hand now. That night, while Sue slept soundly beside him, Bob unlocked her phone using the password he had memorized weeks ago. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages, his breath hitching with every incriminating text. There they were, long, flirtatious conversations with a man named Leroy. Messages laced with innuendo, plans for secret meetups, and even photos that made Bob's stomach churn. He stared at the screen, a cold fury washing over him. The woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, was unrecognizable. And yet, there was no sadness in him now, only determination. If Sue thought she could humiliate him, destroy their family, and walk away unscathed, she was wrong. The morning after his discovery, Bob made a call he had hoped he'd never have to make. "Wilson," he said when the familiar deep voice answered on the other end. "I need your help." Wilson didn't ask questions right away. He simply agreed to meet Bob at the local diner. When Bob arrived, Wilson was already there, sipping a black coffee and looking every bit the no-nonsense sheriff he was known to be. "You look like hell," Wilson said, gesturing for Bob to sit. "I feel worse," Bob admitted, sliding into the booth. "It's Sue. She's cheating on me?" Wilson raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "And it's not just an affair," Bob continued, lowering his voice. "The guy she's seeing, Leroy, he's a drug dealer. She's involved with him in ways I can't even begin to understand. If I leave her, she'll ruin me. She'll take the boys, the house, everything. But if I stay, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know what to do. Wilson leaned back, his sharp gaze never leaving Bob's face. Sounds like you're in a corner, he said finally. But that doesn't mean you're out of moves. Bob looked at him, a flicker of hope igniting. What do you mean? Wilson set his coffee down and leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. If this Leroy guy's a dealer, then he's already on the radar. We can use that. But you gotta play it smart, Bob. You can't confront her. Can't give her any reason to suspect you're onto her. Let her think she's got the upper hand. Bob nodded, his jaw tightening. I could do that. Wilson smirked. Good. Because once we catch them in the act, it's game over. The plan was set into motion with ruthless efficiency. Wilson pulled strings to get a warrant, and with the help of a contact at the cable company, he bugged Bob's house. Cameras and microphones were discreetly installed in every corner where incriminating activity might occur. For weeks, Bob played the part of the oblivious husband. He smiled at Sue, indulged her late nights, and even feigned disinterest in her whereabouts. Inside, however, he was seething, every ounce of his patience fueled by the promise of justice. Meanwhile, the recordings began piling up. Wilson's team captured everything. Sue's phone calls, her whispered plans with Leroy, even discussions about drug deliveries. The evidence was damning, and with each passing day, the trap tightened around her. When Sue announced she was going on a girls' weekend, Bob knew the moment had arrived. He kissed her goodbye, watching her leave with a cool detachment. Let her go, Wilson told him later that day. We'll handle it from here. Bob spent the day with the boys, making pancakes and playing board games as if it were any other Saturday. But when his phone buzzed that evening, his heart raced. We've got them, Wilson said. Drugs, guns, everything. She's in custody. Bob hung up the phone, a grim smile tugging at his lips. The woman who had betrayed him was finally facing the consequences of her choices. But the fight wasn't over yet, not until she was out of his life for good. The knock on Bob's door came late that night, just as he was tucking the boys into bed. He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. Wilson had promised to keep him updated, but this wasn't part of the plan. When he opened the door, he found the nanny standing on the porch, her face pinched with concern. The sheriff asked me to come by and watch the boys, she explained. He said you might want to head to the station. Bob nodded, thanking her, though his mind was already racing. He grabbed his keys and drove to the sheriff's office, his palms slick against the steering wheel. When he walked in, Wilson was waiting for him, leaning casually against the front desk. She's in interrogation, Wilson said, gesturing down the hallway. Thought you might want to say a few words. Bob followed him silently, his steps heavy. When he entered the viewing room, he saw Sue through the glass, sitting at a table in a holding cell. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smeared, and her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Bob felt an old, familiar pang of sympathy. But then he remembered the texts, the lies, the way she had laughed in his face. Wilson handed him the phone. Talk to her, he said. See what she has to say for herself. Bob hesitated before picking up the receiver, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. Sue grabbed the phone on her end, her knuckles white. Bob, she began, her voice trembling. You have to get me out of here. This is all a misunderstanding. The drugs weren't mine. Leroy, he set me up. You know I'd never. You'd never? Bob interrupted, his voice cold. Never what, Sue? Cheat on me? Lie to me? Bring some drug-dealing scumbag into our home? Into our bed? Sue's face crumpled, and for the first time, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't like that, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lonely, Bob. You were always working, and I... Stop, he said, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. I don't want your excuses. I want the truth. She hesitated, then finally broke. Leroy said it was just business, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. He needed a place to hide some things, and I didn't think it would hurt anyone. Bob leaned closer to the glass, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You didn't think it would hurt anyone? You didn't think it would hurt me? Or our boys? You brought this into our family, Sue. You destroyed everything we built. And now you want me to save you? Please, she sobbed. For the boys. Think about what this will do to them if their mother goes to prison. Bob stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of their sons, of the life they had tried to build, and for a moment, he almost wavered. But then he remembered the nights he had spent alone, the lies, the humiliation. You should have thought about the boys before you threw our family away, he said, his voice firm. You made your choices, Sue. Now you'll deal with the consequences. He hung up the phone and walked out, ignoring her desperate cries for him to come back. The next morning, Sue was officially charged with drug possession, intent to distribute, and conspiracy. The evidence Wilson had gathered left no room for doubt, and her connection to Leroy only worsened her case. She was denied bail, leaving her to sit in jail as the legal proceedings began. Bob wasted no time filing for divorce. With the recordings, text messages, and other evidence, he had a rock-solid case for custody of the boys. Sue's lawyer tried to argue for joint custody, but the judge wasn't swayed. Bob was granted full custody, and Sue's parental rights were suspended pending the outcome of her trial. For the first time in months, Bob felt a sense of relief. Sue was no longer a looming shadow over his life. He focused on his sons, throwing himself into being the father they deserved. They needed stability, and he was determined to give it to them. Weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Bob hired a housekeeper to help manage the household and threw himself into his businesses, ensuring his sons would never want for anything. News of Sue's trial spread quickly through the small town. People whispered about her downfall, about how the once perfect wife and mother had fallen so far. Bob did his best to shield the boys from the gossip, focusing on creating happy memories for them instead. When the trial finally concluded, Sue was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Leroy received a harsher sentence, his criminal empire crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Bob didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't need to see it to know it was over. 2 years later, Bob stood on the sidelines of his son's soccer game, cheering as the boys played with unbridled joy. Life had changed, but it was finally peaceful. The boys were thriving, and so was he. He thought of Sue occasionally, wondering if she regretted her choices. But those thoughts never lingered. She was a chapter in his life, a painful, chaotic chapter, but it was closed now. As he watched his sons run across the field, their laughter filling the air, Bob felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had fought for this peace, for this happiness, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. For the first time in years, he felt free.